Cool. Just give me 10 seconds. I'll just set up my timer. Cool. Hi, sir. I'll be going as PM. I'll try my best to take a POI. I'd prefer if I'll prefer if closing asks me one, and also, can someone from OC just notify when you've started recording, and then I'll begin.
It is going on, so you can start.
Cool, cool, cool. Wonderful. Cool. Starting on the self count of three, two, one. Key pieces of framing. First, there are multiple issues with opioid abuse. It exists on a large scale, means that a lot of people opt into it at opioids in status quo. But second, even if alternative exists, these alternatives are highly inaccessible, which makes withdrawal a problem. Now, what's the what's the problem when when alternative medicines are not prioritized? I think one, as long as they're not prioritized, they're significantly hard regulated. This means that either this makes the cost of this extremely high, but second, this makes extreme errors in terms of actually releasing this medicine and making it accessible to the people, but it also makes it difficult for anyone to actually opt into it significantly or use it as a common way of battling opioid withdrawal. But I think second, what this also does is that it has a negative effect against it, which is of drug cartels. Notice how drug cartels want to control the market and want more opt-in in terms of opioids that they distribute throughout. They have better distribution networks because in status quo, alternative medicines do not have or enjoy the same distribution as opioids do, which is why they're ineffective. Hence, they should be prioritized. But second, these the cartels also have incentive to black market alternative medicine, or to significantly either attack its distribution networks, or just make this inaccessible or make this harder to distribute in neighborhoods where there is opioid withdrawal, because they enjoy more control over it via like communications with opioid users on a frequent basis. This is how they also maintain their consumer base, which means these two things already make it incentive enough for prioritizing being a metric and not just alternative medicines existing being enough. But I think then there is a urgency metric that comes into picture here. Why? Because opioid usage has harms on a massive scale. But second, the current regime, that is Donald Trump, has inherent incentives or has a large part of his campaign against opioids as per se, which means that this regime has significant opinions or has significant public opinion in terms of its actual decisions or policies against opioid. But then second, why is it that people can't opt out of opioid usage in the first place, or why do they experience withdrawal that is difficult to deal with? I think the reason why opioid does not withdraw why do people do not withdraw from opioid is because they don't have access to treatment in the first place. But second, because withdrawal symptoms are so extremely bad, they take a toll on the person who's using them at all points in time. So this looks like you not being able to comprehend normal situations if you're a frequent heroin or a cocaine user. But also this looks like you inherently not being able to function in terms of reaching out for help, etc. Because notice that there are certain external factors like your neighborhood or the people you interact with that also come into picture, which make them which double down on you and your ability to actually withdraw from opioid. But I think then the idea is that Trump wants this opioid crisis to end because one, it has en masse consumption, which means a lot of people in American demography have inherent problems or issues that they struggle with in terms of withdrawing from opioids, and we tell you the reasons for it, but also in terms of the neighborhoods and sector that they live in. But second, because this withdrawal rate is extremely less, this is a significant problem that people often hold against the government. And this is something that even if Trump was not in power, every government should have an incentive to deal with. But I think then, what are the ways that we think they should deal with it? I think this is simple: increase supply. Simple economics. The moment you increase supply or you invest, and because you have invest incentive to invest, or you just make current alternative medicines that exist more accessible, you reduce the price. But how do you do it? You relax the regulation on it, and you don't make it extremely hard for these PI after 5:30, Yuvraj. You inherently don't make these medicines harder to create or distribute, which means relaxing the regulation. But this also means reducing cartel influence, because once this price goes down and you're able to readily supply this extremely well, you can't blacklist this product and black market this product anymore. Also, black marketing does not have as much as an effect that it does as of now. But also, you probably now have awareness campaigns that are sponsored by like the government, or like press releases via the White House saying that you have increased subsidies on accessing these medicines, etc., or just encouraging public healthcare institutions to promote these medicines. I think then, if OP claims that it is not usual of Trump to inherently go out and use these measures as a way to tackle opioid crisis, notice how in status quo one, the antics that Trump is using to defeat problems and gain optics is through uncanny and unpredictable measures. Therefore, we also want to establish that he's willing to use unconventional methods to gain certain optics and solvency in this way. How? Notice how tariffs were first established or grounded in American policy. Every person who's an expert on economics said this is going to hurt the consumer in itself. But what did Trump do? He sold it to his like home base, but also created leverage against other countries to inherently promote the tariffs and use it to his own advantage. But thirdly, even if you don't
UIO,
sure.
opioids get you high, they dull your senses, they dull reality, and that's why people opt into it. When you have alternate medicines that produce the same effect, why are people not likely to go ahead and opt into them anyway for the same impact?
Issue is that we're debating whether the US government has any incentive to do so. I think let's engage in that burden. But then on the idea of coming back to Trump, note that even if you don't buy him using unconventional methods, there is just a huge core base that Trump enjoys in terms of the MAGA movement that is more likely to help him. Problem with O is they're likely to go with conventional medicine. Note that conventional medicine takes time. The urgency metric that comes into picture cannot be catered to here. But note that this doesn't trickle down to vulnerable communities that exist in minorities, etc., in poor areas or apprehended camps that Trump has made, or in ghetto areas, because here opioids are more accessible because it's easier to operate within illegal distribution networks here, and you cannot withdraw because cartels wants to make the consumer base or continue to sustain it, and then they readily make it more accessible, but it's easier for them to do so here. But also another impact, as soon as you do this, the FDA goes into it and inherently produces like or maintains just more legitimacy. To maintain more legitimacy as a drug approval organization, it goes into it and puts more money into scaling it up and researching and distributing it well. For example, the way they did with COVID-19 vaccines in America. So on three impacts, OG wants to take this debate. First, on US government aligning with the goals. Second, this aligning, just concluding, on this aligning with the US government's goals. Second, on vulnerable people being better off. And third, better medicines being distributed. Trump gets to make a Twitter tweet, like Twitter paragraph about it. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and call on the leader of the opposition. Here.
Hi, I'll just take 15 before I begin.
Phil.
Wait, let me set my time. Starting in 3, 2, and 1. This is not an actor's motion, which means irrespective of whatever incentives they tell us as to why the US government should align with this policy has nothing to do with whatsoever in this motion. The way that we go ahead and win a THBT X should do Y is if we're able to prove that this is in the long-term benefit of like from a neutral perspective whatsoever, and not necessarily something that is going to benefit the actor at large. First, on the idea of accessibility, we think that conventional treatment is still like accessible to a large extent, irrespective of what they say. This looks like how let's say the gold standard medicine medicines like the methadone are like widely available through, let's say, like federally certified these treatment programs, etc. These treatment programs and these like drug rehabilitation programs, etc., exist only because the US government goes ahead and like invests largely on them. It is precisely because of the large scale of this issue that exists that there is a constant pressure on the government to go ahead and ensure that this is something that remains accessible at any point in time. But also that there are just like other treatments which also, while being regulated at any points in time, are also like I can also be like bought over the counter, etc. But also that a lot of like rehab programs exist like across most states. Even if like they don't like function in like the most effective way possible, they still exist and they still are present, etc. But also that things such as like Medicaid or like its expansion, or let's say like Affordable Care Act, etc., goes ahead and like gives like increased coverage, particularly for this issue, etc. Which means that the idea on like this entire thing does not really stand. The second thing that I want to do is like I want to prove why this goes ahead and like worsens the black market that they want to go ahead and talk about. First, we think that cartels are more likely to exploit these alternative medicines, specifically when the government goes ahead and legalizes it. We think that it is simple. We don't think that at status quo they go ahead and like utilize these alternative medicines as such, because they already have a market pertaining to other drugs that are illegal, etc. What happens when the US government goes ahead and like legalizes this is that you probably have, let's say, a massive demand, because if now let's say that millions are suffering from opioid use, and like if let's say some alternatives then get framed such as like, oh, this is like some new brand new treatment, then we think that demand is likely going to like spike overnight, which means that this demand is going to far outstrip whatever like legitimate or like regulated clinics like that can go ahead and like supply this demand at any first place. Second, we think that cartels have like historically went ahead and like specialized in like these filling in these supply gaps. This looks like how like when Oxycontin was restricted, cartels moved to heroin, or like when that became harder, cartels like started providing fentanyl, etc. Which means that cartels exploit these regulatory bottlenecks. Like if the government allows limited use, then like cartels are going to flood the use with like cheaper and unsafe versions at any point in time. But also that given the fact that these alternative medicines are like naturally sourced, they're simply like harder to regulate, etc. This looks like since cartels already have like international smuggling routes, they can simply like mass harvest these from like let's say southeast or South America, etc. Or like they can simply like mass adulterate or like ship into the US much cheaply, which means that anything that they want to claim on like black markets, etc., the cartel is simply going to like outcompete the US on that. But also that when you have like regulated clinics, they simply cannot compete in terms of like scale or price, which means that patients now have to like turn to these black market versions in the first place. But lastly, we simply think that why this is particularly bad is because cartels can then maximize profit by like going ahead and like mixing it in like fentanyl or meth, etc., or like users seeking treatment even like unknowingly consuming substance that worsen their addictions. The reason why this is like exclusively bad, irrespective of the black market that exists as status quo, is because when people who go ahead and like opt for these alternate medicine from cartels, then they go under this presupposition that this is something that is likely going to make it better for them, without actually knowing that this is something that is like much worse. First thing then, what do we actually mean when like we say that the US government shouldn't support this? As status quo, we believe that a lot of these drugs are classified under, let's say, Schedule 1. This looks like they're simply like not prohibited like to be circulated, etc. Why do we think that is important? We think that one, simply on the idea of like effectiveness, we think that conventional treatments have like decades of data, etc., or like large scale trials, and they're largely approved by like the Food and Drug Administration, like FDA, or like, and they probably have also like demonstrated impact at any points in time, which means that it is empirically true that like thousands of Americans every day like have their lives saved because of these government funded trials, or government funded rehab centers, or like government funded like conventional treatment at any points in time. But secondly, we think that on the idea of like safety and regulation, we think that alternative medicines like are largely unregulated. This looks like how their products are like largely like contaminated with, let's say, heavy metals or like fentanyl, etc. We think that also they don't really have like a standardized dose at any points in time. What this means is that there is no pharmaceutical standard that goes ahead and says that this much dose is like valid for you to like curb your addiction, etc. But also that like, and more importantly, we think that some of these substances also have like similar properties, like similar to what opioid does. This looks like hallucination, like causing hallucination, or like psychoactive, like making people like like having dangerous impacts, especially like in unsupervised or like high risk patients at any point in time. More importantly then is that it goes ahead and like just creates like new addiction cycles, because given that they produce like the identical effect of what opioid does, then people simply like become more dependent on these. What then happens is that when people become dependent on something, the way that drugs mess up with your like brain chemistry, etc., is that it increases your tolerance to the dose that you go ahead and consume, which means that even if like this happens in the best way possible and initially people just use it like in the limited prescribed dose, over time they go ahead and build tolerance against it, which means that in the absence of other government funded like conventional treatment, given that you're prioritizing this, you end up like becoming more tolerant to the sort of dosage that is prioritized, which means you're then likely to then opt into like black markets, etc., to go ahead and like consume higher dosage of this stuff, even if it is something that is like not like not something that is approved by the government. Third, this is simply on the idea of like diversion, right? We think that given that you go ahead and prioritize this means you have to shift funding from like other military infrastructure, but you also go ahead and like state your political will towards these alternatives, which means that this pull resources from already underfunded rehab centers or therapy programs, which are like just barely hanging on. We think then it just makes like conventional treatment a lot worse, and like thousands of people who are then dependent on them go ahead and lose this out. We think that the opportunity cost of like having thousands of people die like is simply like bad, because these proven programs goes ahead and like lose resources at any points in time. The thing and independent reasons as to why we think that we should win this debate is simply on the idea of like the principle of state responsibility that the state owes to people. We think that the way that this works is that like the state derives its power based on the idea that on like you are going to pay me taxes only as long as I can ensure like your safety, etc. We think that the way that opioid affects people is that they simply lose the idea to like consent towards it, which means that it is a state duty to go ahead and like protect these vulnerable people. Addiction destroys their meaningful agency, which means that the state cannot allow them to choose between like opting for conventional treatment or these like alternative medicine, because given that alternative medicine are likely to create the same impact, people are going to make that coercive choice, which means that the state has this duty to ensure that this decision is not taken by these people, particularly because it is not something that they meaningfully make. We think that conventional treatment is far more useful and like something that far more requires resources for that crowd to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech, and please remind everybody to take POIs. They're very important for the game. And welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
Add 30 or more than that.
Sorry?
I'll take 30 seconds maximum.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, I'll take yours and award. I'll start on my first word. If opening up's main principle to win debate is that states have inherent responsibility to provide people a choice, they inherently lose debate anyways, because the entire burden then comes to prove as to why these alternative medication is so bad that they're going to replicate the same effects as opioids in the first place. I think debate can't really happen if the alternative to conventional medication becomes opioids, and that's why O runs in comparative frame and disable them. But to be more importantly, since I'm a responsibility, states have an additional responsibility too, to be able to actually deal with the most urgent matter at the moment and to deal with the most effective way possible. On opening up an LO, there's no proof to explain as to why conventional medication actually works. They say rehab centers and other conventional medications do work, but take a long period of time. The problem which identify opening up is simple: you don't have the time to deal with these problems in the very first place, which means it's significantly urgent and you need to ensure as much effective medication as possible. Why then is alternate medication good inherently? Two things. Number one, the idea on opening government is to solve opioid withdrawals. Why do people want to withdraw from opioids, and therefore why is it an opioid crisis? Because of two things. Number one, accessibility is crude. But more importantly, incentive. People don't have incentive to withdraw from opioids because effective withdrawal is in itself extremely bad, which means that people are scared a lot of the time to be able to actually again withdraw opioids because it is permanent harm and irreversible harm. The way which an opening government to solve this comes is to make this process easier or simpler. You know what? Probably it's the best case on opening up. Fair. Probably replicate the same cycles of drug uses as well. But the problem is simple. A, we don't have the side effects of the opioid itself, but two, and more importantly, we make the withdrawal process easier for people, which means they're able to phase out the process of withdrawal on a much longer basis in itself, and therefore be able to solve a problem in current OG. But two, and more importantly, the problem with conventional medication is simple. They explain to you that the black markets, etc., already exist inherently. Cartels will anyway control routes, etc., and this is a bad thing. The way in which this motion results in opening government is exclusively, the US government already has two things: a capacity. They already have the DEA and other agencies constantly monitoring its trafficking routes and are much more likely to track it on the very first place. But two and more importantly is incentive. Our idea on painting US government incentive is not to prove as to an act is motion, but to prove that the US government has feasibility to achieve in the very first place. Which means Trump is willing to use unconventional methods like say these open medications in order to cure the opioid crisis or at least deal with opioid withdrawals. Which means the US government is more likely to put this on urgent basis. What is look like simply? FDA then, on the basis of this motion, the FDA now probably releases massive reports on a significantly urgent level. The US government signs a particular ordinance telling the FDA, and you know what, probably in the next 90 days, we require an action plan over how to implement this. But to be more importantly, the FDA capacity. Why is that? Because the FDA keeps on checking medication all the time. For example, the COVID-19 crisis, the FDA literally out of vaccines in a couple of months because of the urgent need of the issue, which means the FDA already is putting capacity. But to its incentive, if FDA inherently has incentive to ensure that they are able to get the best medication possible, they will do so because inherently the problem that comes is alternative medication works, and because of the FDA will be more likely to roll this out. But lastly, and more importantly, why are we able to prevent these black markets from then emerging? It is simple. The problem right now is supply demand in equilibrium. Is that currently the demand is high for these medications because they're already seen as effectively good, which ultimately means these cartels are much more incentive to control this. NO's idea that cartels inherently already have control of multiple different drugs, so they won't inherently want to contradict is inherently false. And why is simply this? Is because if something can cure the withdrawal for the curse you're putting on other people, you're more likely to make sure that the cure is controlled by you as well. And this is a significant constraint, and already PM points out to you, right? What is it like? Two things. Number one, the cartel is probably operating in areas that are most vulnerable. Vulnerable how? Two, one, probably education access being screwed or economic access being screwed, which mean communities, for example, who've been ignored by the government, or two, and more importantly, communities who don't have resources to actually access medication at this level. And this is also about conventional medication, right? Conventional medication is extremely high, and pharma companies already charge significant levels of money or on people in order to get this money out of the first place. The problem identification error becomes then that, oh, the US government and FDA have incentives to ensure the medication is cheap, and therefore conventional medication is much more accessible. This is intuitively false. Why is that? Because currently conventional medication isn't produced by the FDA or the US government. It's produced by pharma companies. These pharma companies create monopolies, and that's why they're able to high price in the very first place. This is why you have a pharma medication accessibility in the US itself. On opening government, then what happens is because you have this additional need because of Trump coming to power, etc., in order to address the opioid crisis and opioid withdrawal, ultimately this unique demand created. And this unique demand is a push given to the FDA to be able to approve drugs, but to be more importantly, get companies to subsidize this medication. The way in which you're able to benefit is simple is that the US government believes that this is unconventional but important ways in order to solve the crisis, and then by virtue of that, make it cheaper and more accessible for people because it's directly producing the US government itself, and that's not really a good thing. But then lastly and more importantly, even if you don't buy any of this, the problem I have in the opening up case is accessibility, and this is the issue which their case has. Is that one of the communities, one, don't have economic access, but two are more important structural barriers that prevent them from actually getting medicine in the very first place. This allows black markets to function in the first place. But then the way in which is going to opening government is simple. Is that A, by ensuring lesser prices of the commodities, we're able to get the reach required. But two, and more importantly, we're not trying to propose a high burden and say, oh, we're going to have the open prices at mass. The idea of opening government is simple, and we're going to ultimately try our best
AOI.
to reduce the symptoms of painful opioid withdrawal itself, and therefore incentivize people to engage in opioid withdrawal, and by virtue of that, ensure reduction in opioid consumption. With that, closing 3, 2, 1, opening. Go ahead.
Right. FDA only has approval over synthesized drugs. If you're rolling out natural drugs, FDA can only step in after it's already been rolled out into the market. How do you have FDA control over safety of these drugs?
The problem is simple. Is I don't think a opening government that the US government does not really have the incentive to roll out as inherently unsafe. But two, and more importantly, this stage with way in which the drugs are reaching the market is first on small scale, which means there's no test that comes out, and then they on the basis of tests they have on these number of people or data sets, you're able to then ascertain as to whether the drug works or not. This usually happens in a very expert process. This is also how vaccine trials worked in the first place in the US with multiple companies. But then two, and more importantly, why is this then not violating the urgency principle we run? Because the problem on comparative and opening up is that it probably delayed by multiple months or years, etc., in order to be able to deal with opioid withdrawals, because by the virtue of LO, rehabs are slow, but more importantly, conventional medication is not working fast enough. On our end, sure, a 90-day period exists. We're going to inherently test these medications out as per the regulations, but more importantly, and after this happens, we're going to roll out in mass, because again, when this works, you inherently produce on massive levels, and the more you make by economies of scale, you're able to reduce costs, and this means you're able to expand the amount of accessibility happens on scale, and therefore you're able to give people the access required. Then why can't the closing win? It's simple, two things. Number one, we're able to a priori prove how this accessibility exists, but two, and more importantly, I think vulnerability and urgency exist irrespective of whatever which bench runs, which is why we take over our closing. Aryan, Ghosh, Deputy Prime Minister.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible? Chair, am I
You
clearly
are.
audible? Perfect. Starting in 30. I prefer to take a one, preferably from closing. For the fifth, I'll ask for starting in 10. I'll just read out the motion if that works. Just give me a second. Wait, I can't find the motion. Yeah, is this fine? All right. Uh, okay, okay. Just let me know if at some point I get disconnected or if you're not able to hear me. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening government blatantly lies. They tell you that conventional treatments are not cheap and accessible. I will give you 7 reasons why they're cheap and accessible. 1, these are synthetic pharmaceuticals that have been made in labs, which means they've been researched and developed for it over a long time. But 2, the main consumer base of these particular drugs has been people at vulnerable stages or the US government who's purchasing them to go ahead and disperse them among the population, which means they're forced to go ahead and either subsidize, but 2, the cost to these are low anyway because these are synthetic pharmaceuticals that are produced, which means the raw material cost is low, which means things like methadone, things like naxilitrone or etc., stuff like that are already super accessible to the public because the cost of producing them is extremely low and they're mass produced. The problem on opening government then is that they don't have to, or they had to explain why the cost of importing raw ayuska roots or these raw plants to go ahead and manufacture, to go ahead and rapidly develop an R&D and just create these sort of drugs and to be able to disperse them either without going ahead and placing like massive subsidies through these drugs or to go ahead and take harm upon the government and the government's own funding is something that opening government and closing government had to prove, which means it's just objectively true that these are just easier to go ahead and purchase. But 2, MAT drugs are FDA approved, which means they're covered by shit like Medicare, Obamacare, Medicaid, and most private insurance plans. But 2, we think you had the Support Act that was introduced by which was introduced in 2018 and grants these grants access to MAT drugs through billions pumped into this to make MAT accessible to a lot of different people in community health centers. Which means just objectively, I'm sorry, but I'll take this POI post the 5th. Which means just objectively, this treatment is extremely fair or just extremely free or low cost because you have schemes that have been introduced by past governments to actively go ahead and interfere within the opioid crisis. But 3, you already have widespread infrastructure that goes ahead and allows the dispersal of this to happen. You have methadone clinics, you have certified doctors, pharmacies that allow you to go ahead and pick up these MAT drugs on prescription and stuff like that. But lastly, you have rehab centers and hospitals that go ahead and give you naxilitrone injections that allow you to go ahead and gain greater access to it. But lastly, note that you are unclear on what impact these drugs have in the long term because you haven't developed them, you haven't researched into them. But note that because of all the reasons that opening government gives you, you have incentives and pressure to go ahead and roll it out as fast as possible. Which means not only do you lose all the economic benefits that you've gained so far in developing economic infrastructure, all of these drugs, all of the R&D that is essentially waste because the United States is the largest country in the world that goes ahead and controls opioid addiction. But secondly, we think you largely go ahead and have to invest all of these billions of dollars into developing new disposal mechanisms, or into developing new infrastructure that allows these allows this disposal etc to happen, but allows the R&D etc to happen. Which means it's unclear then why this is not cheap and accessible at all in the very first place. The second thing I want to do is just explain why black markets don't crop up accessibility for opioids. The first is the reason I give you, that methadone and buprenorphine and oxycodone are synthetic pharmaceuticals, which means they can be produced at scale in labs and are inexpensive. Which means it's not inexpensive for you to go ahead to a doctor and demand these drugs for him in case of just like dulling down this opioid addiction in the first place. But two, we think insurance, stable and accessible supply chains that go ahead and guarantee this, allow you to go ahead and disperse this without losing these drugs or without losing tracks or without being unable to regulate these particular drugs all over the country. Which means four, we think the way these drugs are then rolled out is that you have clear markings of how these drugs are going rolled out, which means whether how many drugs are being dispersed, how many are being given to clinics, how many etc are being given to different hospitals etc, and they're required to go ahead and keep a deep check. Which means at all points of time these black markets are unable to go ahead and ever crop up to that extent because these are severely regulated and have excessive mechanisms that allow you to regulate this. Note that the only thing that opening comment tell you is, oh, DEA is still acting on this, whatever. The second mechanism that is why I want to prove is why black markets still go ahead and profit.
UA.
Which means I will take that after the fifth there. The first thing I want to explain is inconsistent supply. Because note that methadone pills that have been perfected over the years into go ahead and actually develop or to go ahead and allow like a steady supply to happen is something that doesn't happen. But two, because of these tariffs that the US government has imposed, it's unclear whether these Asian countries are willing to go ahead and trade with you or willing to go ahead and give you these like drugs to you etc at a cheap cost anyway. Which means at all points of time, it's unclear why these drugs are actually available to you at a severely low cost anyway, which means either the government bears it's unclear, but two, most likely because big pharma is likely to step into this market, the consumers have to bear it anyway. Which means at all points of time, we think legal demand goes ahead and outpaces safe supply on our side of the house. The second thing I want to go ahead and explain is just cultural perception. Because note, the way you market this and the way you go ahead and spread this within like more consumers and the way the US government does it is that you tell them, oh, this is natural and natural is better and this is going to allow you to go ahead and actively get away from opioids and shit like that. The problem with this then is that you allow or legitimize different alternatives that go ahead and market themselves as natural or as better or just as natural things that the government is trying to sell to you that you're probably going to go ahead and get at a much cheaper rate. This explains why this illicit use is likely to come up anyway, precisely because of the perception change that happens. On one side, you have the FDA going ahead and regulating it. On the other side, you have these natural drugs that are seeking into the market. But lastly, we think distribution chains are already hard to police. Note that kratom powder and shit like that are already actively used within the United States to get high and to go ahead and probably act as hallucinogens and stuff like that. Which means even with cannabis, after it was like delegalized and stuff like that, and black market still went ahead and adapted to like probably going ahead and adapt to this supply in the very first place, even after the legalization happened. These are 5 reasons I give you why exactly this is likely to go ahead and result in the formation of black markets. I have 2 more extensions from Pratap's speech. One, and I just want to explain why it benefits the US government not to support alternative medicine. One, this is just on the principle that you need to safeguard your citizens' health and lives. At a point in time when you're going ahead and rolling out under pressure in terms of alternative drugs that aren't properly checked, and they aren't going to be because you have excessive pressure to go ahead and control this opioid addiction, it's unclear what you can do. But 2, the FDA only has legal authority to go ahead and interfere after incidents go ahead and start to crop up, after this has been botanically rolled out. 2, we think you lose trust in medical institutions because people around you are going ahead and succumbing to something that the US government actively interfered in, which means at a point in time when pandemics and crises is rolled around, you don't trust the government, you don't trust the DEA or the FDA or actual medical institutions who tell you these drugs are good and you should take them, which ends in more loss of life. But 3, you end up creating a new addiction crisis in terms of these drugs because you actively go ahead and opt into more similar hallucinogenics, which is actually what alternative medicine is. Which means the primary burden on OG and CG was to prove why these alternative medicines are not likely to go ahead and act in the same way. Given that they act as the same hallucinogenics, they needed to prove why people don't go ahead and get further and further addicted to it. We're able to prove why it's better regulated on our side, but 2, why you have better mechanisms that push you not to get addicted to these other like comparative medicines or conventional treatment. With that, vote for opening up.
I'd like to thank our speaker for their fine speech and call on the member of government to begin the back half. Here.
Oh, can you see my... Oh, you can't see my camera for some reason. Okay, wait, there we go. Can you see me and hear me?
I can see you and hear you.
Excellent, thank you. POIs verbally, please. I won't be looking at the chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Two key burdens that I don't think opening government answers that I'm going to answer that are going to explain why alternative medicine is an effective pathway for rehab that is going to be able to effectively rehabilitate opioid addicts. The first key burden I want to prove is actually answering OO's fair POI about why it is unclear on opening government why people moving away from opioids into alternative medicine, moving away from conventional into alternative treatments is actually good even if it is cheaper. I have two reasons for why it is good even if it's cheaper. The first is that there's obviously still going to be the capacity and the incentive to want to regulate this and to ensure this creation of safe alternative medicines. Why is this? Because even if government agencies have been gutted in the era of Trump widespread, the FDA still remains a relatively robust regulatory agency. And we know this because the current right-wing administration is still quite anti-addiction because it sees addiction as a drain on economic productivity, as a key cause of crime, and all of these things. Empirically, we observe like key Republican or like key right-wing figures like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. specifically being sympathetic to addressing opioid addiction because, you know, he himself was literally addicted to heroin. There are figures that want to make sure it is like safe and not worsening the opioid epidemic, which is obviously causing a lot of economic harm onto these individuals. So obviously there exists a capacity and incentive to do this. Why is it then that prioritizing the use of alternative treatments is likely to accelerate this sort of research into ensuring safe and like well-regulated safe and well-regulated alternative medicine? I think there's going to be significantly more funds available and significantly more focus available into conducting research on how the safety and the efficacy of this alternative medicine looks like. Even if it is true that it's post-product release, like opposition notes in their POI, I think you can still shift the market trend based on the findings that you get from the research and the regulation. And you obviously have much greater capacity in terms of funding and manpower to be able to conduct operations on alternative medicine facilities. So you can bust things like exploitative operations that are necessarily going to significantly harm users of these sorts of things. But you can also crucially create the pharmaceutical standards and testing and reinforce the things that opening opposition is talking about through longitudinal cross-sectional studies that are going to be far more well-funded and far more extensive to actually see if these alternative medicines are effective and actually safe, right? Which means that on the baseline level, you're able to ensure that the medicine that is actually being released onto the individuals are safe. So even if like they are perhaps cheaper, it is much more important to care about them being safe, and we prove why they're far more likely to be safer over time as a result of this adjustment by the government and its regulation. But even if you don't buy that, I think even absent of the best kind of regulation, there still exists competition between alternative medicine suppliers to produce the safest and most effective alternative medicine. Obviously, there are going to be greater amounts of subsidies or financial incentives from the government to accelerate market development into the alternative medicine industry. But most notably, right, this means that like spin-offs of big pharma companies that are now going to invest heavily into the alternative market industry now have to compete against each other to maximize their sort of profit. And it is much more difficult to get a big government contract to place orders for millions of alternative medicine units or getting an NGO contract if your alternative medicine is not clinically proven to be quite safe for individual use, to prevent like the very overdoses that opening opposition is talking about, to prevent further addiction in the same way that people addicted to opioids is going to be addicted. So that means that there exists a strong profit incentive for the very reasons that these people want to make sure that they're going to be able to secure these contracts with alternative medicines to make sure that their medicines are not going to exacerbate the current level of addiction that opioid addicts always face. So opening government, in conclusion, they yap a lot about reducing cartel influence with the implicit assumption that cartels are just bad. But if alternative medicine is no better than the cartels, opioids themselves, they have no impact, which means that on our side, by simply proving that people are going to get better drugs, this is going to improve people's safety and wellness, which means that on a baseline level, consuming these alternative medicines is less likely to lead to them being harmed, which deals with opening opposition's principle. I think it's hung on the practical about whether this is actually going to be safe or not. And I think we proved much more conclusively why it is likely to be safe. That's the first thing. The second thing is then why it is that you're going to be more effective in actually getting them to access rehab. The first thing I want to note is that opening opposition is just like completely assertive in saying you're going to cut rehab programs, because I think they're under the impression that the government is pouring billions of dollars into the actual manufacturing, the actual product and research and development of the alternative medicine themselves, to the point which they can't fund rehab centers. Obviously, this is untrue. Even if they have some amount of market subsidies, I think this is most the development and the manufacturing of alternative medicines is mostly market driven, which means the government still has the pre-existing incentive. NGOs still have the pre-existing incentive to want to, hire doctors, nurses, social workers that are still going to add the human element into not only just prescribing these alternative medicines, but ensuring that the withdrawal process is actually going well, right? Counseling, providing, regular check-ins to make sure that that the victims of opioid addiction are actually using the alternative medicines in a very, very effective and very, very strategic way. So why is it that people are far more likely to actually use the infrastructure and use the processes of rehab comparatively? The first is that I think judgment is not clouded by the immediate need for some kind of short-term hit, because that is now provided by the function of the alternative medicine, which means you're far more likely to be rational and reason-headed in the ways in which you choose to engage with rehabilitation centers. You're far more likely to listen to the doctors or the social workers that are offering you treatments and solutions. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening.
Cool. They're banned not just because of the doses that you consume them in, but largely because of their addictive nature. There is no way to say for certain that these won't be addictive, because this is something that
Got
already
it.
exists.
I already give you many extensive mechanisms why the safest alternative medicines are the ones that are likely to rise to the top or be the ones that are promoted by federal regulation. So you need to deal with what I've actually said already. Moving on, the second reason is that they're able to then seek shelters that are able to provide them with alternative medicines, conditional with them on going through treatment. So the administration of alternative medicines as a way to attract more people to come into your shelter offers these shelters a unique mechanism of leverage to make people actually go through with the rehabilitation programs rather than just maybe them doing it once and then forgetting about it forever. But the final reason is that there's better reception to these drugs, right? Because short-term pleasure is much more effective in actually getting people to continue to go back to these shelters rather than the jarring effect of actually trying to override withdrawal artificially, which means they're likely to stick with the shelters in the long term. They're not likely to be turned away or shocked by the potential much harsher side effects of the conventional treatments that aim to completely remove their addiction without trying to gradually wean it off. Which means that on our side of the house, people are far more likely to A, actually access safer alternative medicines, but B, use those safer alternative medicines as a mechanism to actually access better rehabilitation, to actually effectively in the long term reducing their addiction. For all those reasons, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and call on the closing opposition speaker. First speaker, here.
Hello, Prajwal here, going as a member of opposition. POIs, whenever, just raise your hands and I'll take them. If I don't take them by 6 minutes, you can unmute yourself. I don't care. Give me like 20 seconds and I'll begin. Good. Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, all of CG's case is contingent on one fact, that studies and tests are a magical solution that's going to let you know for sure whether or not a drug is safe for consumption or not. Panel, very simple comparison here. If we're talking, vapes are a very big problem in status quo, right, in every single country. Yet there's not one conclusive study that lets us know for sure whether it's safe or not. Why is that true? Because nobody's able to study the long-term effects of vapes because it hasn't been long enough for us to study them. You can't study what's going to happen to the human body after consuming a drug for 20 years if it hasn't been fucking 20 years. Very simply, how does that relate to this case, right? If we're talking about these alternative medicines, even if people put all their money, all their scientific weight into figuring out whether it's safe or not, you cannot figure out long-term effects without time having been passed, no matter how much money, no matter how many of your best scientists you put onto this. Now, what does this mean? Very simply, right? This means, because understand, if that were true, we would have known by now very definitively that vapes were bad or good, but no, there's still no conclusive study. Keeping that in mind, what am I trying to say by bring up by saying this, right? That no matter how much money Gov puts into this, let's talk about OG's push about urgency and CG's mechanism for why it's necessary for them to study this and figure out whether it's safe. No matter what incentives they give for Gov or for Gov's paradigm, it's simply scientifically impossible for you to do this. Now, why is that important? Let's okay, now let's take down the best case scenario, right? I told you how it's fucking impossible for you to do it in the first place, but you have to do magically plan to do that, right? The FDA at max can only prove that for a certain quality of drugs it's safe. That is, for plants, which understand this is again plant-based medicine as given in the info slide. So for certain strands of the plant, for certain variations of the plant, after a certain set of steps for you to filter it out and then do distillation or whatever the fuck you do to create it, after all of that, only then a quality tested product is what they can say whether it's safe or not. They cannot guarantee that for every dosage, for every strain of quality, for every type of mixture that you can do with that medicine, whether or not it's going to be safe. That means you can never know that when people use it with other medication, when use, let's say, fentanyl mixed with alternative medicine, and they try to use it for who knows how to use it along with heart medicine. Nobody knows what the effect that has on humans. Now, why am I saying all this, right? Let's take a very, very large even if case here. Let's say even if government managed to do everything they want to do, they legalize it, they managed to prioritize this pushing, and they managed to put in rehab centers. Why is it still bad? Understand that on Gov's paradigm, you're only providing this to addicts, right? That's given the motion, because you're trying to provide this as a solution to opiate addicts. Now, understand what exactly is going to happen when government legalizes this. First, people are going to start trusting it. Why? Because the government said so. They said, okay, this is a solution to your drug problem. I'm going to start pushing it. So people are going to start trusting it, not trusting that it's going to solve the addiction, but trusting that it's safe in general. That is, even people who are not addicted to opium are going to still think it's a trustworthy medicine. That is, like, even if I don't have a heart problem, I know that if I take heart medication, I'm not going to die immediately. Like, something is going to happen to me. The same sort of trust is going to translate onto this as well. Even people who are not addicted are going to believe, hey, this very addictive substance is completely okay for me to use. Now, people are going to look at this as a medicine as well. That is, they're going to look at something they can consume over the counter. Now, what does all this mean, right? When you have an addictive substance that's easily and readily available, people who are not addicted as well, I'd like to start using it. Why? Because it's very simply addictive. You're going to try it once when you're in school. You're going to be using it for the rest of your life. Now, again, what exactly is going to happen in Gauss paradigm, right? The government does not have the resources to create every single medicine at this high of a scale. The number of addicts in America is a very large number. I'll take a POI soon. The number of addicts in America is a very large number. To reach that demand, it cannot be done on government fund services alone. This is why they have to take the support of commercial industries. They have to take the support of existing manufacturing industries, which already have the capital and the infrastructure to do this. PIOG before I continue.
Medicines are stigmatized. They require prescriptions. What goddamn school is serving, like, I don't know, opioid based alternative medicines? Like, where is this impact even coming from? Because you need to
I'm getting on the mechanism next, right? So what does it mean, right? I'm telling you that the government is going to outsource the creation of these medicines to companies that have the infrastructure and the capital to do this. Let it be Pfizer, or let it be whatever other large medical company exists. Now, what does that mean? That means you now have mass production of these drugs, mass production of these alternative medicine, which can now be very easily resold and repackaged. All you need is one fake prescription for you to repackage that own medicine, add whatever the fuck you want, add some fentanyl, add some cadmium. I don't know what exactly is added these days to make it more addictive, but add whatever the fuck you want to make it more addictive, resell it, and then get people who were not addicted earlier to get addicted to an alternative medicine. Now, why will they take it? Because it was legal, because it's a medicine, because the government told them they can trust it. And so the government just saying that something is an acceptable form of medicine is enough for people to start trusting it, which is people who would have otherwise not even tried to take something that's addictive. Now because they know, hey, there's not any large scale harm to this, and because they're getting it for cheap, because now black market can simply buy it from these companies that's being outsourced to with a fake prescription, add whatever the fuck they want to make it more addictive, and then they're going to resell it. Even people who were earlier would have no chance to, no incentive to take it, would start taking this. Now, why is this so bad? Very simply, you are increasing the number of people who are getting addicted. You're doing the exact opposite of what this motion is trying to accomplish. Now, they might not be addicted to opioids, but they're still getting addicted to something, right? Now, why is this so bad, right? Understand that we can go back to mechanism, right? I told you how that because of outsourcing companies it becomes readily available, but once you're not able to afford that anymore, what's going to happen? I told you before that the FDA can only say something is safe as long as it's quality controlled and they know exactly the process that it's made from. The black market is not going to provide such drugs. Why? Because you're going to get hundreds of strands of the same plant-based medicine. You can never know which strand is the one that's been approved by the FDA. You're going to take it assuming it's going to be safe, and then you're fucked. Why? So this very simply proves why the black market is so bad, right? Because the quality control that FDA proves, that government is trying to prove with FDA, cannot be guaranteed for every single sort of medicine. So I told you how people who are unlikely to get addicted earlier now are going to get addicted to this. Now, why is it bad for addicts too, right? Understand, in our paradigm, very simply, you can control dosages in rehab. These drugs like methadone have to be given like once every few weeks at a certain exact quantity. That can only be controlled in rehab. On their paradigm, when you're giving something like plant-based medicine, you might take it now when you're in rehab, because it's supposed to be a one-time solution. As soon as you leave rehab, you find it readily available everywhere. You can take it whenever you want to satisfy your cravings. You're not really solving the problem for addicts either. With that, very, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and call on the op whip here. Gov whip here.
Okay. I am not familiar with how Google Meet. It's not Google Hangout anymore. I'm not really familiar with how this works. I don't know if I'll get like a notification that's more salient than the one that I got on Zoom, but I'm going to just say right now that I tend to have verbal POI preferences, so unmute say POI. I don't know, maybe the hand raise or like the messaging on not Hangouts meetings is better, but whatever. So, for a closing opposition that accuses us of making claims about the safety of alternative treatments that seemingly can't be substantiated, they seem fairly confident about saying that, like, oh, well, these drugs are actually super fucking addictive and they're also super fucking harmful. I want to do team by team. I'll first address opening government because there are certainly some takes from opening government that I want to distinguish ourselves from and distance ourselves from. And then I want to respond broadly to what opening opposition says about black market safety. And then maybe it is that there will be some response to closing opposition because it seems their main contention is also about safety. The opening government take that we should deregulate drug safety is certainly one that exists within the round, but I think it loses implicitly to the op push. So I just want to make clear why it is that the prioritization of alternative medicine probably doesn't mean whole deregulation. The first is, I mean, also this stuff has been said by David, but like the FDA, I think, retains the mandate to regulate drugs because people want to know whether the shit that it is that they're putting into their bodies is safe before it is that they're doing it. Of the federal agencies that have had their funding gutted, which is like all of them, but like whatever, the FDA, I think, remains one of the ones that have been less touched financially. The damage that it as an institution has endured under the Trump regime is more so related to the appointment of like a complete fucking nut as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. But while it is that he is a complete moron on most subjects that are related to health, like vaccination, he is at least somewhat more informed and sympathetic to opioid addiction as like a former heroin addict. So it is that I think on this particular issue, like, yeah, the FDA is probably fucked when it comes to other things, but on this specific issue, there is some amount of, confidence that it is that the U.S. government is going to act in the ways in which it historically has, which is to vet and ensure that it is that the treatments that it is endorsing, either tacitly or explicitly, through legalization or like through permitting doctors to prescribe these sorts of things, they're going to want to make sure that it is that this is the sort of thing that is safe, that actually provides relief, instead of just ensuring that it is like this is something that it is that they're going to release onto people without no fucking idea as to what it is that it does. The second thing is like, and this is a more explicit response to what it is that CEO says. There are pre-existing studies into what it is that these alternative treatments like do, typically for, like a different purpose. And perhaps that means that it is that they are somewhat flawed when it comes to definitively proving that it is that, they're effective to treat opioid addiction, or that it is that there definitely aren't any, complications for former addicts. But it is that like they're like, these are known quantities, like these treatments or these medications that have existed for a while. There are studies that have looked into, whether or not they are effective for other purposes, whether or not they are effective. And so it is that we can say that it is, maybe it is that, like, if it is that we want to be the most cautious and the most risk averse possible, we should definitely, probably conduct a study to ensure that, like, this specific combination of opioid addiction and, like, alternative treatment doesn't produce some sort of complication later on in the future. But, like, we can generally say that it is that unless something new information comes up, this will probably be fairly safe. There also, I think, are pre-existing studies that are usually conducted at a smaller scale with, like, a sample size that maybe is not large enough to be able to, like, project onto the rest of the population, that show that it is, like, there are, somewhat promising results, that it is, there are some groups of people that respond positively to these sorts of treatments, and it is that they find that it is, it actually does help them with, opioid withdrawal and opioid addiction. I think to the extent that it is, that's the case. Like, yes, I understand that it is a lot of what it is that we tell you is about how it is, like, we want to make sure definitively that a lot of this stuff is safe, and this is the sort of thing that will eventually happen over time. A lot of the stuff that I think is going to draw the most amount of practitioner and consumer attention, the sorts of things that seem the most promising, are ones that are going to already be looked into to some degree, to where it is that we know that they are probably safe, and it is that we know that they are probably effective. And as time goes on, and as like, the US probably starts funding studies either through the FDA or whatever to definitively ensure that it is that these are safe, and it is that this is, like, an appropriate or suitable use of this specific medication. I think that it is that, like, that will solidify, and it is that a lot of the things that we then talk to you are then untainted or untarnished by the accusation or, like, the implication that it is that they are possibly less safe than conventional treatment. I want to talk about this black market argument because I think it gets pretty robustly made from opening opposition. Structurally, I think the reasoning is sound. Empirically, though, it's just false. The black market argument doesn't work when it is that like, cartels have the financial incentive to not cannibalize their own sales with less addictive and less lucrative alternative drugs. Like, there are also fixed costs that it is you need to take on to establish the procurement and distribution infrastructure for, like, an entirely new drug class, especially if a DLO is correct and that these, like, natural, like, plant-based alternative medicines are sourced from, like, Asia. I'm not going to take on the risk to set up, like, some plant-based alternative to Fent when all of my fucking users are addicted to Fent. The only way in which this happens is if there is, like, so much confidence that it is that there's going to be massive market demand for this. But I don't even think that that is particularly good for opposition to concede, because that just, seems to suggest that it is that they acknowledge conventional treatments and the ways in which they are being set up now are insufficient to deal with opioid addiction and opioid demand. And that's a problem in as far as it is that, like, being addicted to opioids really fucking sucks. It is physically painful to have withdrawals. They also tell you the stuff about how it's, actually conventional treatments are super accessible and super affordable, and therefore we don't need, any alternatives. This is just blatantly false. The, like, things that it is that they tell you about this are actually, like, one, the market consumer is very vulnerable and doesn't have a ton of money, so it doesn't make sense to charge them a lot. And two, like, apparently the raw material cost, or, like, the production cost of synthetic pharmaceuticals are very low. Like, the response that it is that I have to this is, like, a POI that I've written out that I wasn't able to give because they didn't take it. But Frederick Banting sold the patent rights for insulin for $1 because he wanted to make sure that its manufacture and sale was as cheap as possible. But the average cost per vial in the US is still like $100. The reason for this is because it is that consumers need fucking insulin. They're price inelastic, and it is that they'll pay whatever price that it is that you charge them. Sorry, I'm not trying to be hypocritical here. I'll take the POI.
Cool. Your case is that you want profit-driven companies to go ahead and create this massively expensive R&D drug. Problem is, somebody has to bite the bullet on economic costs. It's whether the people, which means it's not accessible, or it's the US government, which means you don't have money for medical infrastructure or other places in the medical
sector. That's your 15 seconds. I'm sorry if it is like I'm getting names confused around, but, like, I'm very certain that it is that there was somebody on your side of the house that said, like, oh, actually, these are natural plant-based alternatives. Like, they don't require a ton of R&D, given that it is that they're already, an existing class of drugs. It is that, I don't know. Yeah, okay. Yeah, like I think that it is that they're an existing class of drugs. It is that they are naturally produced or whatever. I think that it is that there are ways in which their costs are going to be quite low. Okay, fuck. I need to move on. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, the last thing that it is that I want to talk. I know that the motion tries to pit alternative and conventional treatment as mutually exclusive, but the reality is that it is that the two can probably be used alongside one another to patch up deficits in healthcare service provision or to double up on their effects. And I think that means that, like, this massive group of people that are addicted to opioids, they have several different options from which they can choose now. The supply cumulatively of opioid treatments becomes a lot larger when it is you permit these alternatives, which means that it's the price generally of all of them goes down. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and call on the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Hi, my name is Zenith. I'll be going as the opposition whip. I hope I'm clearly audible.
You're audible.
Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm going to give you a couple of clarifications and then I'm going to distinguish why CO brings the most unique point of view on the table as compared to the other houses. Then we'll move on to a house by house analysis and give you a very clear view of why CO takes the debate. Understand that up till now, the debate has been very focused on what effect these drugs would have on the addicts, which drug is better for curing withdrawal symptoms, which has side effects, which is safe to use and whatnot, right? Even if we buy everything that side government says, even if we say that fine, alternative medicines are probably a better solution than conventional medicines, and these should be they implemented perfectly and whatnot, understand that they are still running the narrative that hey, these drugs are safer to use. Understand what happened when marijuana was legalized. The sales of marijuana went up. People were getting marijuana more readily. It's not that there were stores that you could get it everywhere. You still have to work for it. Even drugs that are illegal are readily available to people in the America. I don't think that a drug that the government will actively legalize is going to be very, very hard to attain in the first place, right? Understand what will happen then. Once you have a narrative surrounding the fact that hey, the government is pushing this drug as it's a one-time cure to opioids, or it gives you similar psychedelic experiences without the addiction of opioids. Guess what? A lot of other people are also going to be interested in trying these drugs. And frankly, we right now do not know whether or not these drugs are addictive, and if they are addictive, how addictive they are. At that point, it's really, really unsafe to just send them out in the market, even if government has funds to have research or have FDA do research on all of these things, right? At that point, understand what is going to happen, and what my member of opposition also very clearly mechanizes for all of you is that there's going to be a newer market that is going to be created for these drugs. People who were very against marijuana earlier, after legalization, thought, hey, the government said it's legal, so it's probably not as bad as the other drugs, right? At that point, the threshold for opting into this is lowered significantly. The threshold to attain these drugs is lowered significantly. You just have to make a fake prescription, or you just have to borrow it from a friend who has a prescription and stuff like that. There's endless possibilities of getting these types of drugs, right? At that point, the rise in demand that happens for black market drugs is not because of the addicts that exist in society. It's because of the newer market, or the newer audience to these drugs that is being created in the market, right? At that point, that is where all of these demands for these drugs is going to come from, right? Let's just do a simple house now, right? What OG tells you, OG brings a very rainbows and sunshine cases for you, that this is a really good medicine. You won't have withdrawal side effects if you take these. Understand that that's not how it works. If it was such a miracle medicine, we wouldn't be having this debate right now, right? Understand that these medicines come with all sorts of unprecedented or unpredictable risks. They come with heart conditions, they come with addiction, they come with quality control risks, and how these medications might interact with certain other medications. At that point, when we know so little about these medicines, we can't for sure say that these will either help, because there are no large scale studies to prove that all of these alternative medications can help with opioid addictions. And even if there are no large scale studies to prove how bad these medicines themselves can have an effect on a person, right? At that point, we refuse to buy that these medications are going to be completely safe for the person, or they're going to be completely harmless for this person who's taking them, right? Let's come on to OO, right? OO gives you a lot of mechanization on how black market will work after legalization and all of that. But they fail to prove why the government would not be able to meet the sort of demand that exists in society, right? Understand that if US government is taking a step to push these markets or push this sort of alternative medication, it's obvious that they would have a stock to cater to these people. They would have a stock to give to rehabilitation sites and all of these things. At that point, I don't think the demand and supply issue is coming from there. I think the demand and supply issue is going to come from this newer audience of these drug consumers that are being created, and this newer audience that is opting into things that they don't even know about, right? Kids in schools, when they get their hands on these sorts of drugs, which they will because of the sort of widespread drug abuse issues that are going on in the US, at that point, once this gets a government approval on it, the threshold for opting into these drugs is going to be even lesser, and you're going to create a newer market for these sorts of drugs, OPOI. Oh, sorry, OG.
Cool. Note to panel, no bench so far engages with why it's specifically the US government that allows any of their impacts to happen. There's no weighing on that. Second, on CO, uncomparative literally prove where in the US government there's inefficiencies so that literal school kids can access such heavy drugs. Like,
All right, I get your point. Okay. Understand that even if I'm not talking about school kids, there is still a huge issue of, drugs like salvia and fentanyl killing millions of Americans every year. At that point, if these drugs are available, it's fair to assume that drugs that are legalized by the US government are also going to be available to these people. Fentanyl doesn't, you cannot even get with a prescription, but this you can get with a fake prescription. At that point, I'm going to assume that this is going to be accessible to people who really want to access these drugs. I give you incentives as to why people would really want to access these drugs. I give you proof of why these drugs are not tested yet, why we don't know what sort of harms might come from this. And if the entire rebuttal for that side government has is that, hey, once they're out in the market, we're going to give FDA money and we're going to run trials and all of those things take years and years of studies to actually conclusively prove something. And what if these studies conclusively prove that these are not the right medications, that these are actually way worse for your health, these cause like heart arrhythmias or something like that? What are you going to do at that point? This is already out in the market. You've already made millions more addicted with this stuff. At that point, without proper regulations and all those things, it does not make any sense to go ahead and legalize these drugs, right? Understand that if they're marketing this as a one-time solution to your withdrawal problems and your drug problems, if these were entirely safe, we would never have been having this debate. So there has to be a huge list of side effects that come with these drugs. Understand that when this drug gets legalized, nobody's going to be talking about the sort of side effects that come with this drug. People are only going to be talking about what sort of psychedelic effects you get or what sort of benefits you have of these drugs. Let's just take marijuana for example. Nobody talks about the bad effects of marijuana. People actively push it as a cure for something, it's healthy for you and things like that. At that point, this drug is also going to be pushed that way only. This drug is probably going to be pushed in a way that, hey, it cures your withdrawal symptoms, it's probably good for you, it's not that addictive for you, it gives you psychedelic effects. At that point, understand that you are going to create a whole new market or a whole new section of people who are getting into hard drugs, who never wanted to get into hard drugs in the first place. Probably they were just limited to things like marijuana, but since government approved this, and government would not approve hard drugs for to be easily available, or people would assume so, at that point these people will think that, hey, this probably doesn't have as bad an effect, which proves that you're going to create a newer market for all of these drugs, which proves that this house believes that this should not be legalized or this should not be given a priority. With that, very proud to oppose.
Great. I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech. And just wondering for the debate, what I'm going to do is give some general feedback because people never listen to the general feedback. I'll see you before the call. And then I will give some DOA. So first, I think is important to note is that there was very little characterization done within this debate surrounding the idea of firstly, who are the people that are actually going to be engaging with the type of medicine that we're talking about? Secondly, what does this medicine actually do? So what is it that traditional medicine does, and what is it that these alternative medicines do that is actually different when you experience it? I think some characterization about this came later on in the debate, but it was very late in the debate, therefore it became very difficult for that to actually matter, because I think that there was just a lot of assertions being thrown around surrounding whether or not these substances were addictive, whether or not these substances were something that were going to necessarily be safe, but there wasn't much characterization done around where is it that these substances have been used before? How is it that people experience the use of them? That kind of characterization is very important. I think the second thing then is on the idea of black markets supplying these drugs. I'm just unsure as to necessarily the extent to which this happens on either side of the house. And I think that becomes an issue for every case that people run, is the degree to which this happens. If it happens on a large scale, how many people actually buy into it? What is the number of people that do it? And obviously you don't have to give a specific number, but it's more so just about to what extent is this something that actually has a significant impact upon the way that people interact with rehabilitation or with drugs or within their daily lives? But more specifically with the black market thing, we know that there is a high level of drugs and illegal activities surrounding drugs, particularly within the United States, how much of an impact is this actually going to have on the black market? Because there's already a large black market for illegal substances. Why is it that black markets would necessarily deviate and go towards these substances instead in this debate? I think these are the main questions that I kind of have coming out of the debate, just wondering as to how it is that the world that you are all operating in actually looks like. Now I'm going to give you guys the call. So I think the first we gave to opening opposition, the second we gave to closing government, the third we gave to closing opposition, and the fourth, unfortunately, we gave to opening government. What I'm going to do is go team by team and talk necessarily about what it is that we credit from each team and how it is that it interacts with every other team in the debate. So I think that the first thing coming from opening government that we credit in the debate is, firstly, you likely have like a larger supply of these types of alternative drugs. And this is because you necessarily just ensure that there is more money going into these areas. You prioritize the supply of these drugs, meaning that there is just more access to these drugs, particularly for addicts within opening government's side of the house. And then there is necessarily a claim that this is important because currently there is a black market for it, which means that people oftentimes access unsafe versions of these drugs, which means that people are just more likely to use the versions of these drugs that are more harmful for them. Whereas on their side of the house, you're able to ensure that the type of drugs that they're consuming that are similar in nature are ones that are more likely going to be utilized, are more likely going to have some form of safety standards. I think that the thing then that we don't necessarily credit within opening government is the incentive analysis that they provide as to why it is the case that the Trump administration has the incentive to do this. I think the reason why this is like not credited or not really something that matters in the debate is because they already have fiat necessarily to show why it is the case that the government is likely going to do this. And so we're unsure as to like the strategic significance of them proving that the Trump administration would do it. But I think that what is missing is necessarily how they would implement it. So I think that this mostly comes within the DPM surrounding the idea that the FDA would have some form of regulation over it, meaning that these drugs would be likely be safer. But unfortunately, this comes too late in opening government because at this point you no longer have fiat to implement a model as to how things are likely going to happen. So you have to put in place incentive analysis in that instance to show why it is that this would happen. And the incentive analysis that we get is that there is an incentive to deal with addicts. But this then becomes reliant upon whether or not you are able to prove that these drugs are actually safe or not. And you just prove that there is a larger supply of these drugs, not necessarily that these drugs are going to be much safer. I think that this is important because then when we go on the comparison with opening opposition, they bring a couple of things. The first thing that they say is that there is already available drugs which are much safer. And they say that the reason for why these drugs are likely much safer is because there is just a larger pool of data that you are able to draw from because these drugs have been used to treat people for a longer period of time, meaning that you're able to see how these drugs have influenced people, how it is that they have been implemented by doctors, how it is that they've helped people over time, which means that comparatively to these other drugs, even if you have this FDA approval and there is an incentive for them to be good, you likely just don't have as much data or knowledge about how it is that they work, which means that they're just less likely going to be utilized well or less likely going to be effective, which means that on opening opposition side, you just, even if there is, as opening governments say, a lack of supply, there is likely just a better outcome using the drugs that opening opposition have to defend. But then opening opposition go further and they say that there is probably still going to be a large amount of access to these drugs for a number of reasons. The first is that they say that they are mass produced, and this is comparative because you have to ensure that you have the ability to mass produce these other forms of drugs that are going to become the primary or prioritized way of the US government to help treat addicts who often rely on things such as like government grants or rely on things like Medicaid in order to get access to them. They say things like they are synthesized or made within the lab, which is just easier for them to control than trying to grow things organically. They have lots of reasons as to why the access to these goods and the infrastructure that exists is likely just going to be better suited to the things that currently are used by the US government and sanctioned by the US government in relation to like doctors and how it is that they engage with them, meaning that comparatively, even if it is the case that what opening governments say is true and you have a larger supply, there is likely still a significant supply in opening opposition, which means that you're able to treat the people that you want to, but it is also much safer, meaning that you get better treatment. I think that on this particular comparison, opening opposition are already winning the top half. They then bring two other claims, which we credit to some degree in the debate. The first is on the idea of the black market. So they say that actually it is far more harmful because now demand goes up if people are likely going to be utilizing the drugs that opening government to talk about to a larger extent, which means that cartels can then actually exploit this because now there is a demand for these drugs that didn't previously exist on comparative, which means that now if the black market wants to, they're able to harm people who have become addicted or people who have started to use drugs that they wouldn't have otherwise, which means that it's actually far more harmful on opening opposition. It's actually far more harmful, the idea of black markets for opening opposition say, than it brings benefit, which is what opening government say. They then bring in the idea of a principle. They say that there is a principled obligation for the government to, ensure that there is some form of ability for people to come back from addiction, and therefore they should prioritize the other form that they are defending, the traditional form, because there's an opportunity cost that exists, which means that if you pump money elsewhere, the services likely just become worse that have been proven to work. I think that we, to some extent, buy this principled obligation as a form of weighing, insofar as we do buy that there is like an obligation or a duty on the government to do this, but this isn't an independent principle in and of itself, so it's not something that we necessarily buy to a significant degree or independently credit, but we do buy it as a form of weighing that exists within the debate. I think that then there's just like other things that are said by opening opposition, but don't really have much time given into them, such as things like there's a cycle of addicts that come about from the introduction of these drugs. This is closely linked to what they talk about within the black market. We don't necessarily think it's like structurally proven as to why these addicts are likely going to come about or why it is likely going to be a large problem, but we do think that opening opposition do have enough within their case to clearly beat opening government. Let's bring in closing government to this debate. I think what closing government say is that firstly, there is a lot of reasons as to why there is going to be a safe production of the non-traditional or alternative drugs in their world. They say, firstly, that there is a capacity an incentive for the US government to do this. I think that this is sort of trying to do what opening government missed out in relation to the idea as to why the government has the incentive to actually provide a reasonable idea as to why they should regulate this to a large degree, which is that there are people within the right-wing circles that don't like opioids, they don't like addicts because of the idea of them wanting to engage things like work. Opioids, based on some form of stereotype, oftentimes necessarily mean that people don't engage with work because they become drug addicts and can't contribute to the workforce, which means that because of this, they have an incentive to try and provide the best possible ability for people to recover from addiction. They then say that studies also exist, which means that even if they aren't medical studies, there are studies that exist, which means that you're able to measure how harmful these drugs are likely going to be and measure which ones are the most effective. Then thirdly, they also say that there's internal competition between these companies because companies who are producing these drugs likely have to sell it to the government or sell it to hospitals who then have to distribute it. So they want to be the most effective at producing these drugs so that they are chosen for these contracts. So there is a competition mechanism, which means that they are going to produce safe drugs that are likely going to be working and beneficial for these agencies. They then say that because of all of these reasons, it likely means that there is some degree of safety that you're able to access on government side in relation to the type of drugs that people actually engage with. They then say that this is important because now people are likely going to engage with rehabilitation more because the nature of the alternative medicine that they're talking about is actually going to be easier for them to use, or is going to be nicer for them to engage with. We think that they give a couple of reasons for this. The first is that the type of alternative medicine is one that necessarily means that you get some form of high off of using it, whereas on the comparative, the more traditional medicine is one that you won't get any high off of it, and so there's no reason for you to keep going back. The second reason that they gave is the idea that doctors are going to be more likely going to engage with you, but I'm actually unsure as to why this claim comes about. This is something that's just kind of said. But what I do buy from closing government is that you have an incentive to continue to like engage with this sort of medicine, and you have an incentive to and they prove necessarily that there is some form of benefit or safety that exists for this medication. How does this then compare to teams such as opening government? I think the reason why they're able to beat opening government is because they are able to show that there is some degree of safety that exists for these drugs. And so the claim that opening government brings is that there is like a larger supply of these drugs that exist. The problem with their case is they don't prove that the supply of these drugs is going to be safe or that the supply of these drugs is going to be of benefit. Closing government proved to us that there is the ability for us to ensure that there is some degree of safety for these drugs to be used. And they also prove that people are like more likely going to engage with it for the reasons that they gave, meaning that you're going to get some degree of benefit. They're unable to beat opening opposition for a number of reasons. The first is that opening opposition proved that there is a far higher degree of safety that exists on their side of the house, which is to say that closing government are able to show us it's likely that these drugs are going to be safe. They don't necessarily show us that they're going to be super effective in actually reducing how it is that people interact with, these drugs or like illegal substances or drugs that are like really harmful for them. Whereas opening opposition are able to point to like empirical evidence that shows that to some degree the rehabilitation that they talk about likely works. But they're also able to show that there is some probable loss in investment into these areas, which means that you just leave people out in the lurch, where closing government aren't able to deal with the idea that there is likely going to be some degree of money lost from opening opposition's purse, meaning that they're unable to actually show how it is that you're able to continue providing the benefit to the people who are currently addicted and utilizing the care that they talk about. Because I think that closing government, what they try and say is that there is an incentive to continue providing these services, because these services are things that people care about. But we think that opening opposition are able to show us that there is some form of trade-off that has to be made. And so we're unsure as to why it is the case that you're going to be providing these services on the same level as before, meaning that they would have had to prove that the alternative medications that they talk about is something that is going to be beneficial. The withdrawal for round 4 is actually just been released, so I'm going to do closing opposition very quickly. I think closing opposition say a lot of analysis that is quite derivative surrounding why it is the case that opening opposition show us why these medicines are likely going to be beneficial or harmful, in that you need time to have passed and able to be actually study the medicine to see what the effects are likely going to be, meaning that you aren't ever going to be sure about whether or not this medicine is going to be good or bad. And then they say that people are likely going to trust this medication because the government says that it is medication that you ought to trust. Therefore, people are likely going to utilize it more. Because there is questions over the safety of this medication in comparison to the alternative, it means that more people are going to start utilizing this medication, and you're unsure as to what these effects are actually going to be on people, which is a harm. You're able to avoid that harm if the government doesn't necessarily do this, because the attention is never drawn. They're able to beat opening government because they're able to show that there is like some degree of risk over people using these drugs and whether or not these drugs are going to be beneficial. But they lose to closing government because closing government provide us analysis as to why these drugs are likely going to be safe. And they lose to opening opposition because opening opposition is able to provide us with far more substantial analysis surrounding the idea of the harms that come about if people aren't able to access the drugs that they currently are able to access, which provide them with relief from addiction. So that is the call. I'm aware that I have to cut the OA short there and kind of go through things quickly. So if after round 4 you have any questions, DM me on Discord and I'll be happy to answer anything. Thank you.
Thanks.